Hello, everyone. My name is Grzymala-Busse. I'm the director of the Europe Center, and it's my great pleasure today to welcome Leonid Peisakhin to the Europe Center. Leo works on the legacies of conflict, post-conflict reconciliation, political identities, and media bias. His research also examines how states create and manipulate political identities and persistent patterns of political behavior. He's currently working on two books, one called Contested Nationhood, Imperial Legacies and Conflicting Political Identities in Ukraine, and another book with Noam Lupu on sort of the legacies of trauma and violence across generations. Today, he'll be presenting new research done with several co-authors entitled Who Helps Refugees and Why? Evidence from Poland. So please join me in welcoming Leo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for this kind introduction. Thank you to all of you for being here. I understand that I'm competing with two talks just in this building alone, so let alone all the stuff that happens on campus, because I know that the audience here can be quite mixed. This is not necessarily the case today. I see that most of you are students and postdocs, but usually there are also members of the public, and so this talk is not going to be very, very social sciencey. There will be data, and I'll talk a little about methods, but the focus today is not going to be on methods. The focus is going to be on the substance of what we found in this project. I should also say that this is a project very much in progress. So we only just recently started analyzing the data. There is no paper yet. And therefore, this presentation is especially useful for us because it's a chance for us to get comments and feedback on what you people find interesting about this topic, what results stand out to you, or what else you would like to know. And so any questions and comments are extremely welcome at this stage because the project is at such an early stage. As Anna mentioned, this is a project with multiple co-authors, with Volya Chernysh at MIT, who is also, in fact, here at Stanford. She is a Hoover Fellow this academic year, but she is not here physically today because she's, in fact, at UC Santa Barbara. So sadly, she is not joining us, but I will be conveying your comments to her. And also with Nick Stoop at the University of Antwerp, and Peter van der Wind, who is my colleague at NYU Abu Dhabi. As some of you might perhaps know, Volya and I work on Poland and Ukraine, among other places. Peter and Nick specialize on issues having to do with refugees and also issues to do with internal displacement, and they work in the context of Africa on the Congo. So without further ado, let me tell you a little bit about what motivated this project. The big motivation behind this is not a surprise because it really starts from the fact that we have had an enormous increase in the number of refugees and the internally displaced, the number of displaced people, so across both of these categories has now exceeded 100 million. This is the largest that it has ever been since the Second World War. And so it's a topical issue to try and understand what motivates assistance towards refugees. And when we turn to the state of the literature on this question in political science and economics, what we will find is that a lot of this literature is motivated by the experience of voluntary migrants, that is, economic migrants in the developed Western world, so in the United States and Western Europe. And what we learn from that literature, and that literature dates to the late 1990s, early 2000s, what we learn from that literature is that economic factors matter a great deal in how people behave towards refugees and whether they're willing to accept them and in whether they're willing to assist them. And so one of the main findings from that older literature is that people who feel that they're at risk of losing their job are going to be negatively predisposed towards refugees or towards migrants, I should say, because in that context, we're talking about economic migrants coming to work. And they will be less likely to help. Another set of findings from that older literature has to do with cultural factors. And unsurprisingly, it tells us that those who feel that their national culture is threatened by refugees are going to be less likely to help and will be less likely to be accepting of refugees. In the context of the United States, of course, this is not a surprise. As you know, President Trump ran his campaign, his first campaign, in part on this idea that the national culture of the United States is under threat. More recent literature that has been around for about 10 years now, and people here at Stanford, especially in the Immigration Policy Lab, are responsible for much of it, has looked not at economic migrants, but specifically at humanitarian migrants and refugees. And that literature has shifted the emphasis to other factors, away from an emphasis on economics and threat with regards to jobs, or away to a degree from cultural factors, and towards the consideration of psychological factors, having to do with the notion that some people are inherently more likely to help. So some people are inherently more empathetic than others, and therefore are more likely to assist in general. The media narrative, and of course there has been a lot of writing on this in the media, tells us that there are prejudices at work among these populations in the West that have to accept and receive refugees. And specifically, it tells us that there are national penalties against refugees from the global South. And here, notably, we're thinking, of course, about refugees coming from Syria, but also from African countries and elsewhere in the global South. And one of the questions that we're going to be exploring here is going to be not only what motivates helping behavior in general, so which of these factors that I've outlined here is responsible for helping, but also we will try to understand whether, in fact, there is such a thing as a national penalty against refugees. And so what is our project? What are the motivating questions? I just previewed them for you. So first, we're going to ask which factors explain helping behavior towards refugees. What explains willingness to help across groups? And in this project, we're going to be looking at helping behavior towards Ukrainians and Syrians. So obviously, one group coming out of Europe, another group coming from the global South. And then there is going to be a policy angle component to this presentation, to this paper, where we try to understand how do we get people to assist refugees. So once we understand what motivates helping behavior, how can we engender the factors that are relevant to try and get people to assist more? So these are the big motivating questions. I've already said this. Important to note this again, is that our focus is on refugees, humanitarian migrants, not voluntary migrants for economic purposes. And the empirical data for this project is going to come from Poland, where we have, as you know, Western Europe, Europe in general, the European Union has faced an influx of Syrian refugees and more recently Ukrainian refugees. And this is where we're going to be studying this question. Okay. So a little bit of context. In brief, I think most of you are going to be familiar with this already because this has received so much attention in the press, but the response of Europeans to Ukrainian refugees has been unprecedented, extremely positive. More than 8 million Ukrainian refugees have entered Europe and have been extremely well accommodated by and large. Relative to that, Syrians have not been very welcome. Only 1 million of Syrian refugees have been able to make it into the European Union, and the EU has been paying Turkey to host the rest. So many more million, several more million have had to remain in Turkey and have not been able to enter Europe. Poland alone is the largest recipient of Ukrainian refugees. That's no surprise, given that Poland is the neighbor of Ukraine immediately to the west. And Poland has taken in over 1.5 million Ukrainians, now actually closer to 2 million, but in fact refused to accept 350,000 Syrians that were assigned to Poland under the European Union quota system. And Polish government officials have said, you know, we don't want Syrian refugees. They are culturally distant. They're also a security threat in our society. And therefore they were not accommodated. Ukrainians have been granted extensive privileges, economic privileges within Polish society. They have the right to legally stay in Poland for 18 months, and they receive the same benefit when it comes to access to the healthcare system, for example, as Polish citizens. This has been slowly changing. So certainly during the election campaign that has only just concluded in Poland, there were discussions about whether the provisions for Ukrainian refugees are too generous. But for now, these provisions remain in place, and they're considerably more generous than what Syrians have been facing. So what are the hypotheses that we're going to be testing in the empirical data? Our primary focus is going to be on the role of empathy in explaining helping behavior. So we're going to be asking whether people who are more empathetic are going to be more likely to help more. And then the policy dimension coming out of it is going to be, if empathy is indeed an important factor, and we'll explore that in a second, then how do we increase empathy? What can we do from a policy perspective to actually increase levels of empathy in the general population? We are also going to be examining the role of cultural proximity. So those who feel that refugees are more culturally proximate, is it true that they're more likely to help? We're going to be looking at the role of ideology in helping decisions. So those who vote for far-right parties, are they less likely to help refugees? And we'll be looking at these more conventional factors, wealth, education, and religiosity in explaining helping behavior. Okay, so these are the hypotheses. By the way, I know it's unconventional to interrupt in this setting, but if you have pressing questions or if something is unclear, then feel free to raise your hand as we go along. And there'll be time, obviously, for a Q&A at the end. Okay, so what kind of data are we drawing on? How are we going to be testing these hypotheses? Our data comes from a nationally representative survey of Polish citizens, 2,500 of them. These were face-to-face interviews that we conducted in the fall of last year. So the survey is about a year old now. It took us a while to get our act together and actually analyze the data, but it is a nationally representative sample of Poles. And I just wanted to draw your attention that we're going to be looking at different types of helping behavior. So there is going to be no sleight of hand here, but I just follow along as I talk about different dependent variables. There will be different outcomes on the different slides. So we have asked respondents about whether they helped in the past, so past helping behavior towards Ukrainians and Syrians. And we also have specific data on how they helped. So did they donate money? Did they donate clothing or food? Did they host someone? Did they sign petitions, for example, asking for government policy to be changed? So we have measures of different types of past helping behavior. We have questions about willingness to help in the future. And there we also ask them what type of help are they willing to offer the refugees. And we ask these questions separately for Ukrainians and separately for Syrian refugees. In addition to that, we have a set of questions about support for government policy. So we ask the respondents, do you support the current government policy towards Ukrainians? The current policy at the time of the survey was very permissive, so take in as many as necessary. And we ask them, do you support the current government policy towards Syrians, which was highly restrictive, do not allow almost any Syrians into the country because they pose a threat to Polish security and to the Polish way of life. And then within the survey, we have embedded a question about charitable donations towards Syrians and Ukrainians, where we have offered respondents a certain amount of money, 1,000 zloty, which is equivalent to about $230. So it's quite a substantial amount of money. And we have said to them, here is $230. How would you split this money across different types of charities within Poland? And there they had options to give money to a charity that deals with public health issues in Poland, a charity that builds animal shelters within Poland, a charity that helps Ukrainian refugees, Syrian refugees, and the charity that deals with environmental issues within Poland. Now, we didn't actually give $230 to 2,500 recipients. That would be a little excessive. What it was is that it was a lottery design where, in fact, we said to the participants already at the outset of the survey, 1 in 10 is going to be picked and their decisions are going to be, in fact, implemented. And that's exactly what we did. We randomly picked 10% of the survey responses, and we actually gave money to these charities that these respondents so this is not a non-trivial kind of decision for these people. It's a lot of money that in principle would go to charities of their choice. And notably, they could not keep any money for themselves. So the money had to be distributed across the charity options that were presented to them. And in addition to that, we're also going to have a conjoint experiment. Now, we're going to get technical for a moment. I'm not going to bore you with details of what a conjoint experiment is right now, but I'll talk a bit more about it in detail. But basically, a conjoint experiment is an experiment where you present multiple characteristics of an individual, and you say to a person, how do you like person A with a certain set of characteristics relative to person B with a slightly different set of characteristics? And across multiple comparisons, so you repeat these experiments multiple times, across multiple comparisons, you can back out which characteristics are most important relative to others. And the reason that these experiments are done in this way, this method comes from marketing. The reason that these experiments are done in this manner is because it helps us get around social desirability biases. So if I come to you and I say, here is a single mother with a child versus a single young man, you know what the social desirable thing is to do, what is the right option, so right, quote unquote. But if we bury this kind of characteristic among many others, you're much more likely to express your true opinion as a result of being exposed to multiple characteristics, not a single one. I'm going to talk a little about the design of this experiment in a bit more detail, but this is just a way to try and get at underlying true preferences about what types of people you like or what types of people you're willing to help. That's why there is also a conjoint in the study. So that's all with regards to the setup. And now we are going to talk about the findings and the data. And the first things I'm going to show to you is a very simple comparison or a set of answers. So here we ask on the left, in the left panel, we ask, have you already assisted either Syrians in red or Ukrainians in blue in the past? So this is prior to November of 2022. And we can see that 51% of respondents have done something to help Ukrainian refugees, and only 8% have done something to help Syrian refugees. This is very consistent with the narrative that we have in the media. Europeans, in this instance, Poles specifically, do not help Syrian refugees, and there is a massive gap in helping behavior between Syrians and Ukrainians. But then, when we ask people about the willingness to help Ukrainians and Syrians in the future, there is still a gap, but the gap is a lot smaller. 74% say that they're willing to help Ukrainians in some way in the future, versus 57% who say that they're willing to help Syrians. The gap is a lot smaller here. Anna?
And do you always ask those questions?
The past behavior question is asked at the very beginning of the survey. Future willingness to assist is asked almost at the very end. So there is all the other questions. It's about 15 minutes of gap between them. Nevertheless, your point, which presumably is your point, which is that, there are some effects here that it's difficult to know what it means to say that you're willing to help someone in the future. And in the social science literature, this is called cheap talk, right? So you're going to say that you're willing to help because it doesn't obligate you to actually help. So we should be treating this with a grain of salt relative to actual helping behavior. But it's still quite interesting that the gap is so much smaller relative to the actual behavioral gap, right? And the reason that this gap would be so much smaller, to kind of let the cat out of the bag, is because there are no Syrians. There were no Syrians in Poland. So an opportunity to help Syrian refugees was a lot more limited relative to the opportunity of helping Ukrainians. There are many more Ukrainians in Poland than Syrians. There was a question there.
That was my question. You answered it. Thank you.
Yes.
In terms of just considering Syrians, would you also consider, perhaps this is for future, there was the wave of refugees that were pushed across the border with Belarus. What were the reactions to those? Because that is a potentially larger group of people to potentially help compared to Syrians and earlier.
Yes, so most of these people were not in fact allowed into the country. They were pushed back into Belarus. And this happened in the summer of 2022, so kind of very close to the time that the survey was conducted. So Syrians at that time were perceived by some Poles as a security threat because they were basically, there was a feeling that they were weaponized by Russia and Belarus.
Would there be an opportunity, though, to go and help those people around the border? Because I know that there were some organizations that were going and trying to help people.
We didn't ask this question, so I could not.
Just,
yeah, so this is an important part of the context. So there was this perception, as I said, among some Poles that the issue of Syrian refugees is being weaponized by Russia. So there was also that. That explains potentially some of the negative attitudes and some of the gaps. Okay, so here we've looked at past self-reported, past helping behavior, self-reported willingness to help in the future, whatever that might mean. We should take that with an enormous grain of salt. And then we have actual helping behavior within the survey in this charity question. Are you willing to give money to a charity that supports Syrian refugees versus Ukrainian refugees? The answer is that 50% have given at least something to Syrian refugees, to a charity that represents Syrian refugees. 61% have given at least something to a charity that represents Ukrainian refugees. The gap is 11 percentage points, a lot smaller than the gap on actual past helping behavior. Now, when it comes to the amounts that people are willing to give, Syrians receive a lot less than Ukrainians. So people are giving on average about $22, so almost 100 zloty, to Syrian charities, and around 37, around $40 to Ukrainian charities, so almost double. To position it in the kind of entire context, remember that they could give money to different charities. So the charity that receives the most money is the health charity, so a charity that looks after the health of Polish people. They receive more than double of what is given to Ukrainian refugees. Then the next charity is the one that helps animal shelters within Poland. That's the second most popular. Then it's Ukrainian refugees. Then it's a charity that helps with environment in Poland. And then last, in terms of the amount of donations, are the Syrian refugees. So yes, the gap is much smaller here, but the Syrian refugees are still receiving a lot less than any other cause out of this set of options. So these are the outcomes. This is the pattern of outcomes that we observe. And now we will try to explain this pattern of outcomes. So which factors explain the behavior and the choices of people whom we surveyed. So as I said, our focus is going to be on empathy, on the psychological factor. And so what we do here is that, which is quite unusual for a political science paper, we actually bring in an index from psychology, the interpersonal reactivity index, that measures empathy levels in the underlying population. Psychologists, those of you who might be familiar with that work, like to have very large indices. So this index actually consists of 25 questions. We have cut it down to 7, right? So as political scientists, we have to implement these things in the field. It's very difficult to implement, an index that has 25 questions. It'll take 10 minutes for a respondent to answer all of those. And so we shrink it down to 7. And out of these 7 questions, some measure what in the psychology literature is known as cognitive empathy, and others measure affective empathy. I just wanted to talk about this for 1 second because this distinction is in fact intuitive and it's very important. Affective empathy is your ability to feel the same emotion as the other person without necessarily understanding the cause of this emotion. So imagine that someone comes into this room now crying. You might feel like you might want to cry yourself, or you feel sad when you see this person crying. You have no idea why they're crying. You just feel sad because you see this person being sad. Cognitive empathy, in contrast, is a feeling of understanding the cause, taking the perspective of the other individual without necessarily feeling the same emotion. So you were standing out in the hallway, you overheard a conversation. You come into this room, the person who was standing out in the hallway comes in crying. You don't feel sad, but you think to yourself, I understand why this person is crying, given the conversation that they just had. And I've been in, or rather, this person comes in crying and you say to yourself, I've been in a similar situation myself. I think I know why this person is crying. So cognitive empathy is about understanding the other's emotion without necessarily feeling it. Affective empathy is about feeling the same emotion. The reason this distinction is so important is because, as we will see, or we will not see, in fact, but as I will tell you, we do see it in this data, is that cognitive empathy is a lot more important in helping decisions than affective empathy. So it's not enough to feel the same emotion as the other person. What is important is that you understand why they feel that. And we're going to be exploring this in a bit more detail later on, empirically in the presentation. So if you read these questions, you will see that some of them get at this, do you feel the same emotion as the other? And others get at this, can you take the same perspective as the other? Can you understand what they're feeling or where their feeling is coming from? Okay, so here the dependent variable of the outcome is future assistance. And what we're trying to understand is how are these relative factors affecting one's willingness to help in the future, to say that you will help in the future. And we're looking at helping towards different groups. So Ukrainians here are in blue, represented by a triangle. The Syrian assistance towards Syrians is in red, represented by a circle. These coefficients are standardized for those of you who are political science PhD students and postdocs. So they're expressed in standard deviation. So once the standard deviation change on the causal variable leads to a certain standard deviation change on the outcome variable. And the reason we standardize them is for comparison purposes, so we can compare the magnitude of the different variables across these different categories. And so what you can see is that in terms of the magnitude of the effect, the most important effect is the effect of empathy. That's by far the largest effect relative to the zero line here of all the other characteristics. So whether one is relatively wealthy, whether one has higher education, this is what the education variable measures, whether one owns a house. So you'd think that somebody who owns a house might be more able to help, let's say with hosting, for instance, or they might be wealthier, whether someone is religious, whether someone lives out on the countryside. To give you a sense for the magnitude of the effect of empathy, the empathy scale is out of 21 in total. And so 5-point increase on the empathy scale, that's one standard deviation on the empathy scale, leads to a 10 percentage point increase in the willingness to help. So that's this effect in standard deviations on the outcome. So as you go up by 5 points on the empathy scale out of 21, you become 10 percentage points more likely to say that you're going to help. Okay, so that's actually 10 percentage points is a substantial effect for one standard deviation change on the independent variable. And we can tell you that, as one would expect, as your empathy levels increase, you become more likely to help. And here we're looking at a different outcome. We're looking at how much you're donating to Ukrainian and Syrian charity. Syrian charity is in red, Ukrainian charity is in blue. And you can see that even though there is consistently a gap between how much you give to either, there is an upward shaped sort of curve here. So the more empathetic you are, the more you're willing to help. Yes.
Question, how does, so some of the other charities, public health, the animal one, those also relate to empathy, although a different sort. How is that factored into it?
I don't know, because we didn't look into it. So your question would be, does giving to those other charities look in a similar way? And the answer is, I have no idea. So we just haven't looked at it. So I'll make a note of that. Okay, what about cultural similarity? And so the way we measure cultural similarity is that we have a question in the survey where we say, imagine a 10-step ladder where all Polish people are on step 10. On this ladder, where would you place a Ukrainian person? And then where would you place a Syrian person? And so, for example, Ukrainians on average are placed on step 6. So cultural similarity with Ukrainians is 6 out of 10. Cultural similarity with Syrians is 3 out of 10 on average. And so here we're looking at, as you place the individual being more culturally similar to you, what is the effect of that on giving, again, on willingness to help in the future here? And you can see that there is an effect, it's statistically significant, but it's very small. Relative to the magnitude of the effect on empathy, which was 0.2 of a standard deviation, here we're looking at a much smaller effect. So yes, cultural similarity matters. Yes, if you feel more culturally similar to someone, you're more willing to help them, but it matters a lot less than whether you are an inherently empathetic person. Yes.
How does perception of cultural similarity to empathy relate? Like we mentioned, if you're more empathetic, you find it easier to relate in general across different groups. So you would have different judgments or a cultural similarity potentially.
Good. That's another question that I cannot answer because we haven't looked at it. So you're asking what are the determinants of cultural similarity? And we can look at that in our data. So we haven't run this analysis and we're going to do that. So that's a good point. Yeah. What I will be talking about is what determines empathy, and that's something that we did explore, and I'll talk about that. But that's a very good point, is there a connection?
Yeah, to what extent a cultural similarity effect could be accounted for by the similarity, correlation, similarity right. Between empathy driving cultural similarity.
It's an empirical question. I don't know the answer to this, but that's a good point. Okay. And then here also we're looking at other factors, and here you can see the effect of the vote for the far right at the bottom. So the ideological factor. And again, here Ukrainians are in blue, Syrians are in red, and you can see that it doesn't matter. Your willingness to help Ukrainians is not impacted by your ideology. There is a broad ideological consensus that you will help Ukrainians irrespective of where you are on the ideological scale. We know this from the press. It does matter a lot for your willingness to assist Syrians. So if you vote for the far right, you will be much less willing to assist Syrian refugees. No surprises there. That's consistent with our expectations, but it's good to see that proven empirically. Okay, let's talk about what types of refugees are more likely to be helped. And here I'm going to talk about the conjoint experiment. So as I said, this survey contains a conjoint experiment. In fact, there are two of them, one on Ukrainian refugees, one on Syrian refugees. The outcome of interest here is your willingness to host this refugee. And so the question literally asks, here are two types of individuals, individual A and individual B. Which one of these individuals are you willing to host? And what we vary in this experiment is obviously the place of origin. It is always the case that within a single conjoint experiment, the place of origin is fixed. So you're either Ukrainian, individual A and B are both Ukrainian, or individuals A and B are both Syrian. So we never compare a Ukrainian to a Syrian because we expect that Ukrainians will always get priority in that kind of pairing. So this is within the Ukrainian pair and within the Syrian pair. We vary family status. So is this a single young man or a single young mother with a child? Age is something that's constant, person in their early 30s. We vary the person's racial characteristics, whether they have a white skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, or whether they have darker skin. This variation is realistic both in the Ukrainian and the Syrian contexts. We vary religion of the person, are they Christian or Muslim? Again, realistic within the Ukrainian context as well, because as you probably know, in Ukraine, there is a large Muslim population, Crimean Tatars. We vary the person's prior history. So are they just a refugee or did they have family killed in a violent attack by Russia? And then we also vary the person's economic status. Okay. So these are the attributes that we vary. We randomized the order in which these attributes are varied across the different pairs. In total, we run 30,000 iterations of the conjoint experiment. So every respondent gets to see 6 experiments within Ukraine comparison pair, 6 experiments for within the Syria pair, and you end up this way with 30,000 observations from the conjoint, which then helps us back out which factors are the ones that matter the most in explaining helping behavior. And these are the results. At the moment, we're looking at an average across both Ukrainians and Syrians. So we're not separating out yet by Ukrainian or Syrian population. Okay, so what do we see here is that within each of these categories, family, skin color, religion, suffering, there is the reference group. So for example, single young man within the family status category, and then we look at the effect of the other variable relative to the reference group. So relative to your willingness to host a single young man, are you more or less, or in the same way, willing to host a single young mother with a child? And the answer is you're much more likely to host a single young mother with a child than a single young man. What about racial characteristics? Does a person with a white skin, are they more likely to be hosted than the person with darker skin? The answer is yes. The effect is negative for somebody with darker skin, but the magnitude of this effect is actually very small. Certainly a lot smaller than the magnitude of the humanitarian effect that we have with family status, with single young mother, with a child. The effect of religion, no surprises there. This is rather depressing. This is what we know from the media. If you're a Muslim, you're much less likely to be hosted than a Christian. Does your level of suffering matter? So does it matter that you had relatives killed? The answer is yes, gets you to a slightly more positive outcome. But again, the effect magnitude on that variable is not very large. And then very interestingly, there is a penalty for being rich and well-educated or humanitarian migrants. This is unexpected, and this goes against the established findings in much of this literature. This literature tells us people make decisions to help others coming into their country, to help migrants, based on their ability to contribute economically to the society, to the host society. Do they have the right educational qualifications? Can they get a good job? Are they going to be a burden on society? And what we consistently see here is that those who are imposing a burden on society, single young mother with a child, a poorer person who doesn't have many qualifications, these people are actually more likely to be helped. And in this way, assistance to forced migrants, humanitarian assistance, appears to be driven primarily by humanitarian factors and not by economic factors, which dominate the literature on economic migrants. Volodymyr.
Why are you surprised? You mean you are asking about the willingness to hold them in their house, and this willingness it depends on the perception of how much do they need to be hosted in a house rather they can afford renting a house. Yeah. So if you were asking about willingness to host them in a country, then that would be about perception of how much they can contribute to the well-being of the country.
Well, it's a tricky, I mean, that's one way to think about it, exactly what you're suggesting. Another way to think about it is you say to yourself, okay, so I'm going to let someone who is really in need, who is doesn't have a good occupation, who is very poor into my house. And the questions that arise out of that are going to be, are they ever going to leave? When are they going to leave? How are they going to support themselves financially? And so there is also financial fear at the same time that you should be having as a host, saying to yourself, am I getting myself into trouble for many years to come because this person is never going to leave and they're going to become dependent on me? So I'm not sure that the calculation is always straightforwardly humanitarian, which is what you're suggesting here. I think there is also a competing logic which says this person is going to become a burden on me, not on society only, but on me as an individual. I mean, maybe I'm too cynical. I mean, you're a historian, I'm a political scientist, so maybe this is the difference between disciplines, but I think that both of these calculations are in play. Anna?
This conflates wealth with, basically assets, right, or skills rather, right, and skill specificity. So you can imagine if just someone who's just well, it might be different than as a programmer who is, represents somebody who already has highly mobile skills, who will do well in the world no matter what, and so agile and blah blah blah.
Yes. So it is the formulation here, unfortunately, conflates wealth and skills. So we are not able to separate this out by design. But yes, that is a thing. Okay, so let's look at willingness to host Ukrainians and Syrians separately. So these are the averages across both groups. What does it look like if we compare the two groups? What are your expectations? Do you think that the same factors and exactly the same? So this is a teacher in the. I'm sorry, I apologize, coming out. But we still have a bit of time. Would you expect that the same factors and the same level of magnitude explain hosting, willingness to host Syrians and Ukrainians, or do you expect to see big differences? So it's going to be exactly the same set of variables, and there are going to be two coefficients, one below the other. Do you expect them to be exactly the same in exactly the same place or in different places?
I think that's what the characteristics will matter more for Syrians.
So you expect them to be different, right, different places. Does anyone expect them to be in exactly the same place? That this exactly the same factors to the same level of magnitude will explain whether you're willing to host Ukrainians or Syrians? If you do, just raise your hand if you think it's going to be exactly the same for both groups. Okay, so no one has raised their hand. I expect that people are not sure. People are not sure.
One person responds to the other question.
Okay, so unsurprisingly, as you already guessed, it's going to be exactly like this, where in fact the factors that matter in hosting decisions matter in exactly the same way for Syrians and Ukrainians. So if you are a Ukrainian Muslim, you're just as likely to be penalized as a Syrian Muslim. If you're a Ukrainian person with darker complexion, you're penalized to exactly the same degree as a Syrian person with darker complexion. If you're a Syrian single mother with a child, you're just as likely to be hosted as a Ukrainian single mother with a child. What does this finding mean? This finding means that there is no such thing as national penalty. There is no national penalty against Syrians. If you are a Syrian Muslim, for sure there is a penalty, but the penalty doesn't come from the fact that you're Syrian. It comes from the fact that you're Muslim. If you are a Ukrainian Muslim, you're going to be just as penalized. It has nothing to do with the fact that you're Ukrainian. Being a Ukrainian Muslim, being Ukrainian in that combination of factors will make no difference to whether you're likely to be hosted. Volodymyr.
Does it mean that your thesis about prejudice against Syrians related to their to the perception of their being instrumentalized doesn't hold? So no matter that Russia and Belarus want to weaponize this flow of migrants into Syria, we do not punish them because of that. We punish because of their religion or their complexity.
We punish them because of their religion and their complexion, and not because Russia is invading a country next to Poland. Turns out that this geopolitical factor that everybody's thinking about and everybody's saying, well, why are the Poles so much more likely to help Ukrainians? Well, it's because Russia is this common enemy and it's right next door. It actually turns out that what matters more here are the inherent characteristics like, are you a Muslim? Do you have darker skin? Are you a single young man or are you a single young mother? And if you think about it logically, who are the Syrian migrants? What are their characteristics? They tend to be Muslims with darker skin who are single young men. What is the characteristic of Ukrainian refugees? Women, because men cannot leave below the age of 60, with fair complexion, and many of these women come with children. And so, of course, Ukrainian refugees are being helped a lot more, not because they're Ukrainian, but because on these other characteristics that actually determine helping behavior, they fall within the right categories. Fair complexion, Christians, young women with children. Yes.
Sorry, my misunderstanding, but it's like, but here you're comparing a Syrian to Syrian and Ukrainian to Ukrainian with different ethnic characteristics. So the Syrian mean, and like who you prefer to host, but you can't decide to host no one, right? So the Syrian mean is different than the Ukrainian mean. Like to me, this is evidence, right, that like descriptive characteristics might remain the same in Syria and Ukraine, but there might be a Syria penalty still that would not show up in this. That this doesn't rule out.
Right. So in the overall population, there is going to be a Syria penalty that's due to these characteristics.
No,
So
no,
by
that's separate. Just the Syrian penalty. Because if you say that someone is Syrian, you're less likely to host them. I would think that the police comparison doesn't repeat that, right? Because this comparison, these results, the fact that it's the same result, that shows that that's good characteristics matter
in the same way in both
but
populations.
it doesn't mean that there is no Syrian penalty.
It's suggestive of the fact that there is no Syrian penalty, because if the descriptive characteristics matter in the same way within each of these populations, then that suggests that, yeah, that is an interesting point. Yeah.
It's like an interstitial shift, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
meaning is different, but the characteristics matter in the same countries. Because I don't think, because that would explain why people are less prefer to host on average, that mean is different. Yeah?
Well, there is a reason that people prefer to host less on average is because Syrians are inherently different in their descriptive characteristics as a population of refugees from Ukrainians. This is what this result shows to us, right? So if more Syrians are Muslim with darker skin and single young men, this evidence here shows us that they're going to be less likely to be hosted on average.
But it would explain the empathy gap, right? So the graph that you had where the donations increase with the likelihood, with basically empathy, there's still that gap between Syrians and Ukrainians, right? That persists.
Right, that gap has to do with the fact that descriptively the Syrian population is different from the Ukrainian population, so we should expect to see that gap. Let's come back to this. Let's come back to this in the Q&A. Yes.
Is the argument then that previously people have made the point that nationality here is what's most salient? Because to what degree is nationality just conflated with these descriptive characteristics?
Yeah, so previously I think that much of the emphasis has been on economic factors. So I think that the conventional literature, historically in political science, tells us that it's whether the person speaks your language, whether they have the right occupation, whether they have a good chance at assimilating, is going to dictate your attitudes towards them, your willingness to help. And what we find is quite different. So this is the primary difference. In many ways, we're not saying that there is no national penalty. What we're doing is we're breaking it up. And we're saying, why is there a national penalty? Is it just a matter of national prejudice? Or is it a matter of what makes up this vision of what a particular national category means? And what is it about the national category that makes people prejudiced? And what we show here is that it's about being Muslim, darker skinned, and a single young man. If your nationality, if your refugee category nationally is defined by these characteristics, you will face prejudice. So
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
So we're not saying that there is no national penalty. What we're saying is that there is no inherent national prejudice, that the penalty is explained by these component factors. You break it down into components, and what you see is that these are the components that explain the national prejudice.
I wonder what would happen if you compare Syrian and Ukrainians with similar descriptive. If you did vary Syrian against Ukrainian, wouldn't that be the most test?
Right. If we had a darker skinned Muslim Ukrainian young man compared to exactly the same Syrian, would we not find a difference?
Yeah. I think that would come out of a conjoint if you compare.
That's right. So we didn't do that conjoint. So I cannot tell you the answer to this, but that is an interesting question. Yes, just cannot cannot answer it. Okay, so findings thus far. So what I hope I have shown to you is that, and this is an answer to this question that was asked about, where are we relative to the literature, is that humanitarian factors explain better assistance to refugees than economic factors. We found that inherent empathy is the largest determinant of the willingness to help. And what we see specifically is that mothers with children and the poor are helped the most, not single young men who are programmers. I should probably qualify this after our discussion. We say that there is no national penalty. At least we try to open up the black box of what it means to have a national penalty. And we show that those who are culturally more distant are less likely to be helped. And what does cultural distance mean in this instance? It's about fear of Islam and racial intolerance. And of course, in the context of Poland, as we know, fear of Islam is actually stoked by the previous governments. As a result of these set of findings, we have a government policy that bars Syrians from entering Poland, so fewer chances to actually help them. The fact that most Syrian refugees are single young men, and that there is a greater cultural distance from Syrians, the level of assistance towards Syrian refugees is going to be low. We've kind of tried to open up the black box, and that's the conclusion that we derive here. The next question that we're going to ask is about empathy. So, I've been going on about empathy and the role of empathy in informing helping behaviors. So where does empathy come from? And can we actually change it? So if we know that it's important to be inherently empathetic for helping, can we make people more inherently empathetic? How can we go about that? And those of you who have gone to these talks by people at the Immigration Policy Lab know that empathy is manipulatable through perspective-taking exercises where you ask somebody to imagine what it would be like to be in the shoes of the refugees. And there are some effects. Like, you imagine what it would be like to flee your home, what would you take with you, where would you go? And that makes you more likely to help. So this is findings from existing surveys. These findings are very, very short-lived, but nevertheless, they do exist. Okay, so I've made this distinction previously between affective and cognitive empathy. So feeling the same emotion as the other versus understanding where it's coming from and what they're feeling. And so what we'll try to do in a moment is to manipulate cognitive empathy. We'll see if we can actually increase it. So first of all, is there actual evidence that there is this hypothesis out there that is called, from psychology, called altruism born of suffering hypothesis, that says that those who have experienced suffering in their lives or whose families have experienced suffering are more likely to be empathetic, are more likely to be altruistic. So if the idea is that if you've been displaced or if your family has experienced displacement and it was an important event in family history, you're more likely to assist people who are being displaced because you understand cognitively, cognitive empathy, higher, you understand where they're coming from. You understand their perspective. Is there evidence that, in fact, past experience of violence matters? And the answer is yes. So here we're looking at these outcomes. This is assistance behavior towards Syrians. So how much do you give Syrians? How much are you willing to help them in the future? How much did you help them in the past? The pink bar is for individuals whose families had experienced displacement during the Second World War. So as you probably know from Polish history, there was a great deal of displacement as a result of the Red Army and the Nazi armies coming in. Then there was some displacement from Ukraine into Poland after the war. So there was quite, I think, more than 30% of respondents have experienced their families have experienced displacement during World War II. And so here we're saying those people, are they more likely to help? And the answer is yes. These differences between these bars are statistically significant across these different types of helping behavior. Now, next, we try to engender cognitive empathy by actually designing an experiment that reminds people of shared history of suffering with Ukrainian and Syrian refugees. And the experiment consists of several treatments. The first treatment reports these two paragraphs. The words in red here are Syrian, that's replaced by Ukrainians, and the Ukrainian treatment, we will basically say Russian military intervention is responsible for the fact that there are these refugees. Poles, like few other people in Europe, know what it's like to be at war with Russia and to flee from violence. not that long ago, Polish families had experienced the same fear, the same shock, the same emotions as Syrians or Ukrainians are living through. So that's one intervention, and we show these images, in this instance of Syrian refugees and of Polish displaced people during World War II. And then the Ukrainian treatment, this is replaced by an image of Ukrainian refugees fleeing Ukraine. And then in the second treatment, we make it even more specific. We say in 1939, invasion by Nazi Germany from the West and the Soviet Union from the East displaced millions of Polish civilians. Poles have first-hand experience with forced migration and military aggression that Syrians or Ukrainians are living through now. So we bring it, we make it very, very direct. Try to emphasize the strength of the treatment. We try to increase this understanding that your family history or the history of Poland in general is actually similar to the history of Ukraine under Russian aggression, Syria under Russian aggression. Do you expect that these treatments are going to have an effect? Do you expect them to increase helping behavior? Yes, there was a yes there somewhere. Yes, and I see some nodding. Okay, these treatments failed to have an effect. So the bars in blue, that's the comparison for Syrians across control, shorter treatment and longer treatment. So blue bars are Ukrainians, willingness to help Ukrainians in the future. The red bar is for Syrians. So what we're doing here is we're not comparing within treatment, we're comparing red bars across 3 different treatments and blue bars across 3 different treatments. The differences in effect are not statistically significant across these treatment conditions. And if anything, the result for Ukrainians is actually downward sloping. It goes in the opposite direction from what we expected. So in fact, we failed to increase this sense of cognitive empathy in our sample of respondents. And where that leaves us is with the conclusion that empathy matters a great deal, inherent cognitive empathy, but actually it's difficult to engender. At least we found it difficult in this form of the treatment. Activation of a memory of the family or national experience of violence has been ineffective. There is a study that tries to activate the memory of the Holocaust suffering among Jews, actually in the United States. It's a paper by Wayne and Zhukov that came out in 2022, where they also, like us, failed to, they were looking at willingness to accept refugees, and they likewise failed to increase willingness to accept refugees among the Jewish population whose families suffered in the Holocaust. And the reason they give for this failure is because they say that this memory of family suffering is too salient. It's always salient in this population, and so there is no way to increase that sense of empathy, to increase the memory of that experience because it's already so salient. So maybe, I don't know, but maybe we have the same situation here where if the memory of family experience of displacement is already highly salient among our respondents, then the treatment simply fails for the reason that this is something that people talk about and are aware of on an almost daily basis. That's it. That's all I have for today. And I guess we have time for Q&A. Thank you.
So we only have a few minutes left for Q&A, so I'm going to take a few questions maybe and let Leo answer more than one at a time, depending on how many there are.
Paula Ganga, visiting fellow. Very interesting and quite fascinating. Can you remind us more specifically, because I think at some point you mentioned when these studies were done, and I think it was fall 2022, yes. And you kind of suggested that the situation might already be changing with the prolongation of the conflict. My question is more about how would you, like, would it be possible to test those particular changes? And especially thinking in terms of like the prolongation of the conflict themselves. Like we know the Syrian conflict has been going on for a while, the Ukrainian, the same. And this idea of a fatigue within the population that's receiving the refugees might be something worth considering, like exploring even more. So your results are already quite sad. I'm curious just how much worse do they get? What do you think?
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a fascinating talk, super interesting. I have a couple of questions on empathy in this like last part that you showed. So, you know, on this null finding at the end, my first reaction was also like, well, maybe everybody just knows that and it's not new information, but I think An alternative is that the treatment might not have been strong enough because if I understand this correctly, you just have people read something, right? Not really like having them asking them to engage with something. And based on my reading of the relevant literature, like the effects are stronger if like you have people actually like write something about their feelings or like empathy or something. And then my other very quick question: have you looked at the content results by empathy?
How things are changing now. Well, I mean, my answer to you as a political scientist is that I don't know. I mean, we need to conduct another survey 1 year out. For sure, things are changing, right? There is a tiredness that's setting in. I think that this point that Volodymyr Kulik made earlier about the fact that people were driven by humanitarian factors a lot more initially. You looked at somebody and you said, this person needs help, I'm going to take them in. I think today, what I was talking about, which is this financial category case, so this person has been in my house for 1 year. What they do is simply remind people that their family is of immigrant stock. So they go to the American population, and they just have one sentence in there saying, by the way, remember, everybody in the United States came from somewhere else. We're all migrants here. And what they show is that that one sentence creates an effect. People become more willing to assist. So you don't even have to do anything. You just read one sentence about your family being migrants in the 18th century, and that's already sufficient for their study. So difficult to know. With regards to the role of empathy in the conjoint, yes, what we see is that people are more willing to host if we add empathy as a factor into the conjoint, so willingness to host, in addition to these factors that we explore here, it's highly statistically significant. It explains hosting behavior in the conjoint across all categories, across any pair.
I wonder if your effect of striking difference between willingness to accept single man and single mother with a child can lead us to assume that not all those who you called refugees, who are conventionally called refugees, are perceived as refugees. Some of them are perceived as not real refugees, but just migrants, people who are looking for economic opportunities. And of course, among Ukrainians, also, I mean, they initially were pushed out by the war. And of course, overwhelming perception was that they are refugees, but maybe a closer experience with some of them shows that they are rather migrants seeking to take advantage of this situation. So, but the main effect of this single man as with mother with a small child is about perception, refugees versus migrants.
Yes, so for sure this is a factor in here, and I think that Syrians are more likely to be perceived as economic migrants than humanitarian refugees, and the single man effect I think captures some of that. We cannot say for sure because we didn't ask sufficiently detailed questions in the survey to get at that, but that's very likely what is happening here. And one of the reasons why things are changing now over time is exactly because of this, because now more families are thinking about Ukrainians. Are they actually humanitarian refugees? Did they come from the war zone, or did they come from elsewhere? Did they come from Western Ukraine, where there was no fighting, and they've now come to take, whatever government subsidies or to try to settle within the European Union?
Can I also ask a really small question on this? Because it just occurred to me that maybe at the time of this specific, when you asked the question, when you're asking about a single man coming from Ukraine, wasn't there also the possibility of people saying, oh, aren't you actually trying to escape fighting in the conflict for your country? So maybe adding that to the...
It's a bundle of things, yeah. So we don't know whether it's because they are perceived as economic migrants or whether they're perceived as people who are running away from their duty to serve for their country. We cannot know, but for sure all of these factors are in there. It's a bundle of factors.
I'm curious about whether there's significant variation among respondents from the border region versus like the rest of Poland? Are people who are more exposed to the flow of migrants more likely to help? Or are those who might be a little less immediately affected by it more likely to help?
It's a great point, and we actually we planned to explore this variation, geographic variation in the sample, and we can do that, but we haven't actually run those analyses, so I cannot answer your question now, but we will look into this. It's a very good point.
With that, please join me in thanking Leo Peisakhin for a fantastic talk. Thank you so much.